always invalidate. Even Iraq was, you know, Saddam Hussein was put into power by, and was a paid employee of the CIA, and he was put in there because actually they had a socialist government that had used all their oil revenues for public health and public infrastructure, free higher education for all, and so forth, and really had the most flourishing economy in the Middle East and Central Asia in the world. So that we never heard about. Well, that I would say was an inchoate, beginning to be life economy, but it was attacked by, including Saddam, but he couldn't take that away from them. The only way they could take that away really was to bomb them back, as they did from 1991, deliberately destroying all their life infrastructures and so forth. So that when you go to the life economy, though we've never really seen it consciously develop that way, people are normally into that. People are out like that as individuals. That's what they hope for their children, for their old age, and so on. And that whenever it starts to be instituted, that's what gets attacked. That is what's called the enemy. And we've seen the same thing go on inside our own society, where we demonize any social programs and so forth, and use the deliberately created deficit, that's a story in itself, deliberately created deficit to cut them all back and so on. So that you really have, the taboo seems to be to say anything that calls into question the ultimately regulating value system of the society, and the more it does do that, the more it'll be taboo or unspeakable. And what seems to be most taboo and most unspeakable, in fact, is eradicated from the First Nations people on, is anything that actually attends to a life economy. Life received and working for means of life for more life. That seems to be what is most of all forbidden. From the past, we learn the present, you know, but the same sort of mechanisms of operations of repression of any such information is just ruled out as unspeakable. And in this way, virtually any conspiracy theory can flourish, because anything that contradicts it, or more basically the interests it represents, is eradicated as basically the enemy. And I didn't mention to you guys, but when I first just brought up the issue of cui bono, which is a principle of forensic law, which is the first thing when you have a criminal site, a criminal occasion, the first thing you do is ask the question, it's just standard process, who benefits from this? That's what cui bono, to whom the benefit? And that's a standard question that you ask in any criminal situation. Well, obviously there was a lot of benefits that were going to the Bush administration, who had just stolen an election, as we later learned, through electoral fraud, who had also was presiding over what was a deep slide in the stock market, whose president had as his major backer the biggest corporate fraud in all of American history, the head of Enron, and Ken Lay, and he was basically, and there was a whole anti-globalization movement that had become out of control. You remember Quebec City, also Genoa, 500,000 people on the streets. So I just asked the question after the war, because I gave a keynote address to Science for Peace at University of Toronto, which a lot of people were there, and it just said, pose that question. What are the benefits? And then there's anomalies around the questions of just how did this whole thing happen when buildings collapse at the speed of greater than the speed of gravity and so on. And just by asking that question, I was, for somehow it got around into the American press, and I was being called Osama McMurtry by the Wall Street Journal in its editorial, like within 24 hours. My university had hundreds of emails denouncing me, including an ex-colleague. And the Globe and Mail wrote 2 ferocious editorials from 2 different people. And all I did was ask the question, cui bono? So that's how you stop. That's how you stop the unspeakable. That's a taboo.
Yeah. Graeme, you were going to intervene at some point and say that you could see a very neat connection to 9/11.
Oh, it's gone now.
I don't think so.
No, I will speak for a minute. I want to do something fairly simple, which I hope will fit in with what John was saying, which I thought was very insightful. And that was just that I was watching CNN coverage of 9/11 the other day. Fortunately, I have the whole thing downloaded on my hard drive, so I can actually go through the whole of 9/11. We have this for several broadcasters, and I urge you to do it. It's very interesting if you're especially somebody who's used to close reading, meaning that you know how to watch things very carefully and to see what's going on. So I'm watching CNN as the events unfold. And
now, wait a minute. You're watching 9/11 as they were reported on CNN on the day, the archival version of it.
Yeah, sorry. So it's been archived. I've got it on my hard drive. I'm sitting at home watching it, watching the actual original 9/11 coverage as the events unfold. Do you understand?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess there's four little things I wanted to briefly mention that I saw that I found interesting. First was they dragged old Alexander Haig on during the day. Now I forget, Secretary of State, wasn't it? So you may not remember him, but former Secretary of State Alexander Haig is being interviewed. What does he think? This is while the event is still going on. The cameras are kind of panning to huge cloud of smoke in New York, and I guess more smoke from Washington. And what does he think? And I'm not saying the old guy was in on it. I have no idea. Like, I really don't know the names of who was in on this, but he seemed kind of happy that America could finally get its priorities straight. And he said, there's been so much talk in America about social justice and so on, and spending so much time on that kind of issue. And now we know what really matters, and it's terrorism. That's what really matters. Now we can get our priorities straight, and we can go after terrorism. And I thought, how interesting. Because, of course, it's true that there was a great upwelling of movement for global social justice. And some of it was called the anti-globalization movement. And it had massive street demonstrations and nonviolent civil disobedience. And it had captured the public imagination. And it had people who were skilled at symbol and narrative. And what happened? Then we got 9/11 with all the what shall I say, symbolic power of shock and awe. Violence is the ultimate scene stealer in these kinds of things. We don't care about your anti-globalization CD, civil disobedience anymore. Look what we've got. We've got planes crashing into towers, human beings on fire, leaping out of a 110-story building. Can you beat that one? The symbolic power of this. And so there's Alexander Haig saying, now we know what the real priority is. It's terrorism. Now think about that for a minute. Like, think about, I was looking up the other day, well, let's look at, say, 2003. That's the year they invaded Iraq. How many Americans were killed through acts of international terrorism? According to their own, they have an institute that counts this stuff. 15. 13 of whom were killed while they were in the Middle East or Afghanistan. How many Americans were killed in traffic accidents that year? 42,000. But again, going back to John's point, the 42,000 we don't care about because that's just the price. That's the price we all accept for the petroleum economy and the money makes money economy and so on. But the 15, says Alexander Haig, wow, that's where we really have to give our attention. Now, of course, when you raise that with people, they'll say, well, it may have only been 15 that year, but 9/11 there were 3,000. Yeah, but who killed them? That's the question. That's the question. And that's what I hope we'll get into talking about later. Second thing I looked at, Senator John McCain. Now, there may have been somebody else quicker than him to make this point, but he was the first one to make it on CNN, as I recall, and that is that he said, this is an act of war. Now, this is a very important comment. Bush himself made the comment, I believe it was the next day in his official speech, but McCain was already saying it on 9/11. And actually the CNN reporter was fairly sharp with him initially when he said, this is obviously an act of war, and she said, why? He didn't have anything to say. He didn't have a definition for war, nothing. Just puffed and fumed a little bit. It was an act of war. But you have to see how important this is. Because of course it could have been defined, for example, as a crime. The things that were done on that day were in fact crimes under international law and could be dealt with as such. If the U.S. government had agreed to support the International Criminal Court, for example, there are all kinds of things that could have been done. When you define it as war, then that's when the military-industrial complex can do its thing. We know the United States is the most powerful state in history when it comes to war. I'm talking in absolute, not relative terms here. With the ability to annihilate everyone. So naturally, that's the game these folks are good at, and the game that they were clearly keen to play. And you could see that McCain was itching to play that game, and that's what they did in Afghanistan and Iraq. The third thing I wanted to mention is journalists on the scene for CNN talking as it happened about witnessing explosions in the towers. Oh, it just blew up. This kind of thing. You know, they've been silenced. They're now no longer supposed to be part of the record, but there they were. There's a lot of journalists, both the anchor people and the people in the field, who are saying, my God, you know, things are being blown up. And it's quite intriguing to me when, you know, think about the implications when our society says, well, we don't care what people are actually perceiving with their senses. We don't care. Even if you're a broadcaster, it's your own journalist who's saying, you know, I watched it blow up. You silence them. See, to me, this is really a dangerous point for a culture. When you begin saying you don't care what people perceive, you're more interested in the official line. And that brings me to my fourth point, and I'll shut up here, and that is the classic point on CNN when the anchor says, oh, I'm just receiving some new news here that a third building, I believe it's World Trade Center 7, has collapsed or is collapsing. And then he looks at his little screen, and it's just standing there.
It's announced on BBC 20 minutes before it happens by a journalist who's standing in front of the building.
That's right.
World Trade Center 7, that it's already collapsed. And there's the building behind the person, and it's 20 minutes before it collapses.
In CNN, it's more than 20 minutes before. This is about an hour in advance when its collapse is announced. And my last point is, then over the next hour, we keep getting the camera going to World Trade 7, and we keep getting a thing at the bottom of the screen, World Trade Center 7 on fire, may collapse. And then finally, about 15 minutes before it gets down, the thing changes to World Trade Center 7 poised to collapse. And then it's on the verge of collapse. And then, of course, it finally collapses. Now, the thing that's odd about that is, according to the official report, U.S. government report on 7, this was a completely freak thing. That a 47-story skyscraper made of steel would come down from office fires. It's the first time in history. And they say that this can only be explained according to a bunch of freak things that happened at the last few minutes. And there's CNN. Somebody knew well in advance. So those are just 4 things I wanted to say from watching just a few hours of that CNN coverage, which I think reinforced this disturbing notion that certain data that we receive will be given no place in the system because they somehow contradict the core, I'm not sure what you call them.
Well, the regulating group mind.
The regulating group mind is fine by me. Yeah.
Well, the regulating group mind was also, I'm not sure if it was it CNN or was it another network that had that bizarre little moment when immediately after the collapse, I think, of the South Tower, there's a man in a baseball cap who's being interviewed by the journalist, and he says, "I saw," and he speaks like an actor. He speaks like a you know a kind of sitcom actor, not a very good actor perhaps. "I saw the plane go into that building," he says, and because the steel was being melted by the kerosene, you know, the building just couldn't stay up, and that's why it fell. So
Which
he was
contradicts the
obviously-
laws of physics, of
he
course,
was obviously
the melting
there.
temperature of steel.
He'd
Yeah.
been hired
Yeah.
to implant that
Yeah.
that notion.
But imagine being hired